of you to the first ever interview of our club, Giffen, Madras School of Economics. Today, we have the privilege of hosting a distinguished economist, policymaker, and an academician, Dr. C. Rangarajan, who is our SQ chairman and also the Reserve Bank of India former governor. He is known for his transformative monetary policy and his contributions to the Indian economic landscape. His work has been instrumental in shaping the macroeconomic stability and also the financial sector growth. We will be covering multiple aspects today, beginning with an in-depth discussion of the Union Budget 2025 to 26 and the monetary policy updates, which will be our primary focus. We will then lead to a student and professional life questions, followed by a few questions from our MSE students. Alright, let's begin. So, Mr. Chairman, let's begin with the crucial aspect of this year's budget, the income tax relief for the middle class. I'd like to give you a few numbers. In 2023 to 24, 8.09 crore individuals filed income tax returns, and nearly 4.90 crore of them reported zero taxable income. This means only about 3.19 crores actually paid income tax, that is 2.2% of the population. So given that such a small proportion of the population contributes to the direct tax, do you think such relief actually impacts the GDP growth? And also, given that the MPC is higher for the middle class than the rich, can this limited taxpayer base still drive a substantial economic expansion?
The finance minister has indicated that the loss to the government because of the introduction of the concessions is about 1 lakh crore. This is the estimate she has given in the budget speech. Therefore, this is the extent of the stimulus that is available. And the giving relief to the income taxpayers is one aspect of the problem. That's a political economy problem. On the other hand, if we look at in terms of the stimulus to the economy, it depends on the marginal propensity to consume of the households which get the concession and their consumption basket. Because we need to look at not only the overall amount in terms of the demand, but also of the types of commodities for which the demand will be created. Therefore, in that sense, you can argue that one can argue that it is limited in scope, but at the same time, it can act as a stimulus because the overall expenditure can be a multiple of what the concession amounts to. Because, for example, if the household buys a durable consumption good and uses the money that has been released as the first payment or the second payment for it, then the total amount of expenditure that will stimulate the economy will be much higher. Therefore, in that sense, it's a small thing, but the point is essentially whether it will sort of generate a multiplier effect in the system. After all, if that is additional income that people have in their hands, then they spend, and out of that, people continue to spend, and you can get a cycle going as a consequence of that. Therefore, I had written in one of the articles that its relief is one thing, and the extent of stimulus will depend upon a number of factors. But anyway, it is a start of stimulus that is provided in the system, and it can work. But obviously, This by itself will not bring about all the changes that you want. I think in any case, the finance minister has estimated the income growth also modestly. I mean, I think the nominal growth that is indicated in the budget is 10.1%. Therefore, assuming that the implicit price inflator of the GDP is about 4% or a little less, then they are really talking about a growth rate of about 6 to 6.5%, which is reasonable. Hopefully that if the rate of growth goes up, then it creates a buffer in the budget which will enable them to increase their expenditures.
So as you mentioned, it leads to the second question. So in your article, a budget that is mostly good, but with one wrong move. You mentioned your concerns about the government moving away from a clear glide path for fiscal deficit and instead focusing more on reducing the debt to GDP ratio. So traditionally, fiscal deficit has been the key indicator for the financial health and guiding investors' confidence. So without a clear deficit reduction plan, do you think this shift could create uncertainty in the markets or impact the macroeconomic stability?
In a sense, the fiscal deficit and debt GDP ratio are interrelated. The debt GDP ratio can go down only when the fiscal deficit goes down. Because what is fiscal deficit? So the fiscal deficit is the increase in the stock of debt from period 1 to period 2. And that is what is the borrowing that is being done in that particular year, and that is once again the fiscal deficit. Therefore, the government cannot bring down the debt GDP ratio without acting on fiscal deficit. Therefore, the point that I had made was that it is more transparent than the other thing. Therefore, we can start from any level of debt GDP ratio and then derive what the implicit fiscal deficit is given the rate of growth in income and so on. Similarly, we can say that if the fiscal deficit goes down from the projected level of 4.4 to 3% in certain number of years, then we can calculate what the debt GDP ratio will be at the end also. But the point that we were making was essentially that people now know what the fiscal deficit is, and it is the difference between the revenues and the total expenditure, and that indicator is well absorbed now, and therefore shifting it to some other indicator is not that desirable. I mean, and I also want to tell that the numbers relating to the fiscal deficit, then that the center should limit itself to 3% of GDP, and the states will all, each or another, will limit their fiscal deficit to 3% of the state domestic product, and therefore, in a sense, the total borrowing of the center and states taken together will be 6% of the GDP. Now, this is related to the household savings in financial assets. The household savings in financial assets plus the net inflow of resources from abroad or the total investable resources. My argument has always been that if the fiscal deficit is very large, then what is available out of the investable resources for the private corporate sector and others will be limited. And therefore, there is some clear relationship between the fiscal deficit and the extent of it, what it draws out of the investable resources. If you want private investment to pick up, then the fiscal deficit cannot be at a much higher level. Therefore, from that point of view, the fiscal deficit conveys a direct message, and therefore we argue that it is better to keep the focus on fiscal deficit.
Sure. So, speaking of fiscal priorities, another key area that received much attention was about agriculture. So, despite the government's push for initiatives like than the Danya scheme and the Mission for Cotton Technology, the budget has actually reduced the overall agriculture allocations, especially in key areas like crop husbandry and the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana. So, do you think these budget cuts contradict the stated goal of prioritizing agriculture? And if no, what are the fiscal measures could have ensured both financial discipline and a stronger support for farmers?
See, when it comes to public expenditure, we must understand how much can the government increase the total expenditure. In this year, according to the budget, in the coming year, according to the budget, the government public expenditure, overall expenditure, increases by 8% or 8.2%. When the nominal income is increasing by 10.1%, public expenditure increases only by 8.2%. Now, this is necessary because it depends upon what the gross tax revenue growth is, and non-tax revenue, and the extent of fiscal deficit we can keep. And therefore, in a sense, that when the minister brings out saying that I'm spending more on this, more on that, it all essentially means that somewhere else the expenditure will have to be cut. Therefore, the most important thing is prioritizing expenditures. I mean, we know how much the government can spend, given the constraint of the fiscal deficit. Therefore, the priority is critically important, perhaps even in agriculture. It's critically important. It is what needs to be done in order to be able to achieve certain objectives. I believe, for example, the self-sufficiency in oilseeds has been talked about for many years. This is not the first time we are talking about it. Therefore, in terms of while evaluating expenditures, the most important criterion is performance. Whether these expenditures result in achieving the purposes for which it has been done. That is why performance budgeting becomes critically important as far as the expenditures are concerned. Therefore, we should really see whether the new emphasis that is being laid in agriculture is most appropriate or not.
Yes. So, one more last question about the budget. So, budgets often come with unexpected elements. Like, was there any particular announcement in 2025-26 budget which you found surprising or different from the past trends, like in terms of policy direction or sectoral focus?
What did it?
Any surprising element in this budget which you find different?
I mean, we all look forward to the budget and we always get some surprise or the other. Perhaps the biggest surprise was about the tax exemption limit being raised to 12 lakhs. One had thought that it may be raised, but raising it up to 12 lakhs, which means almost everybody who gets 1 lakh as monthly income gets out of the net of the income tax. And that is because but there is a critical question there, namely we have been all talking about widening the tax base and lowering the tax rate. That is the principle that had been followed. So it did come as a surprise. Perhaps it should have come as a pleasant surprise to quite a few people.
Yes. So thank you, sir. That was an enlightening discussion about the budget and fiscal policy. So now shifting gears to monetary policy, I'll let her start it over.
So the questions included in monetary policy section is from the monetary policy report released on February 7th. So the recent repo rate cut by the RBI to 6.25% aligns with the global central bank's easing rates to counter economic slowdown. But this move would widen like the bond yield gap between India and US, which might result in more capital outflows from India, and that might actually exert more downward pressure on INR. So how should the RBI strike the right balance between stimulating domestic consumption through rate cuts and ensuring currency stability amid the risk present in the foreign exchange market?
There are multiple objectives before monetary policy, and therefore the question of balancing them becomes critically important. Largely speaking, the two objectives before the central bank, particularly in the Reserve Bank of India, are been stimulating growth and maintaining price stability. There are also other objectives, like what you had said about taking care of what is happening in the foreign exchange market. So, the inflation targeting flexible inflation targeting system try to provide a balance between the two objectives of growth and price stability. Therefore, asking the Reserve Bank of India to maintain price, consumer price rights at 4%, plus or minus 2%. The flexibility that was given to the Reserve Bank. Now, sometimes other considerations also include. At a time when the Reserve Bank of India thought that it is appropriate to lower the policy rate in order to stimulate growth, because the inflationary pressures, according to them, are coming down, and they are actually postulating much lower inflation rate in 25 or 26. Therefore, they are thinking that we are moving in the direction of the target rate of 4%, and therefore some stimulation to the economy is needed at the moment, and therefore lower the policy rate. But at the same time, you are faced with a situation in which, because of external factors, primarily the value of the rupee is coming down rather sharp. And at that time, yes, when the interest rate is lowered here, but the interest rate is maintained at the same level elsewhere, then the margin or the gap between the two widens. And it can stimulate the outflow of resources from India. That is, people maybe selling their stocks in the market and taking the money back. Right? So, in that situation, one has to balance things. Perhaps the Reserve Bank of India lowering the policy rate only by 0.25 basis rate is perhaps an indication. They could have done even more. If you really wanted to stimulate economic growth, if they could have done it by 0.5% growth. But they did. Therefore, they are in balancing the intensity of the measure also counts. It's not just the measure. Therefore, in some sense, they have taken into account what is happening in the foreign exchange market and what is happening to the value and done. I think the decision is correct there, in my opinion.
This is the second question. With the RBI setting the standing deposit facility rate at 6%, how effective do you think this rate will be in managing excess liquidity present in the banking system in the overcoming quarters? Given the current economic conditions, what potential risk or challenges do you foresee in maintaining this rate?
Now, the whole point is that given the situation, the first decision to take is that whether the Reserve Bank should act. And they have acted by reducing the policy rate. All the other rates are related to the change in the policy rate. Therefore, the question to ask is whether the change in the policy rate, what kind of an impact it will have on the economy. Will it stimulate the growth, meaning that when the rate of interest is low, what happens as a consequence? First of all, the lowering of the rate, the policy rate, by the Reserve Bank should now get reflected in the lowering of the other interest rates in the market, which is somewhat happening a little bit maybe in the call money market, but not in the bank's deposit rate or the lending rate. Nobody has yet announced a reduction in the deposit rate or the lending rate. Therefore, the impact will come when such decisions are taken. And the bankers always view the problem by saying that they can change the interest rate only on, let us say, on deposits which are now being taken. They can't change the policy rate, the rate of interest on deposits which have already been with the bank. Therefore, it is only at the margin they can change the interest rate. Therefore, how the lending rate will change is also somewhat doubtful. Therefore, first of all, the policy rate to have an impact, all the other interest rates in the market should move in the same direction. Secondly, the whole question is, in the literature, there's a lot of discussion about what happens when the interest rate is changed. You all read probably the Keynesian view. The idea is that if the rate of interest goes down, then given the marginal efficiency of capital, it will stimulate investment. And as investment increases, then income will increase. This is the question is, which interest rate? According to Keynes, it was the long-term rate of interest, because what he is talking about is the link between interest rate and investment, whether it will be stimulated or not. But there are others who say, no, that's not the way in which it works. Hartley argued that the impact is through the short-term rate of interest. How? Because when the short-term rate of interest is, let us say, raised by a central bank, then the cost of holding inventory will go up. And therefore, what will they do is, they will release the stocks. And therefore, the availability of this commodity increases. And therefore, that will lead to the fall in the price level, because you raise the rate of interest. The central bank raises the rate of interest when it wants to control inflation. Therefore, he said the control in inflation happens because of the short-term rate of interest going up and the stocks being released or the inventories being drawn down, and therefore that is the way it works. Therefore, there are large number of studies that are there available, depending upon studying the impact of interest rate on the various decisions. By and large, the conclusion that has been drawn is that the rate of interest will be effective only in the case of large long-term investments. That is, for example, housing. If they are in fixed loan interest rate system, you are committing yourself for a longer period, either because the rate of interest goes up or goes down. And therefore, there it is critically important. But in some other areas, it is not important. There is also another view, which is, for example, in the Radcliffe report in UK many years ago, that they took the view what is called the 3 years view. Namely, they say that small increase or decrease in interest rate will not have any effect. You have to move from 1 year to another year, and then only it will be effective. So there are a lot of discussions about in the literature on the impact of interest rate on the economy. But at this particular moment, it is felt that even a small stimulus can have an effect because the impact will be felt through the change in the environment from a feeling of going up can come, and therefore it can happen. So we have to wait and see how much effect the change in the interest rate will have on the economy.
The RBI has highlighted global headwinds and trade policy uncertainty as key concerns. What steps should India take to reduce the vulnerability to these external shocks?
The external shocks are originating in foreign trade. The most important decision of President Trump is in relation to the tariff levels. He is, of course, using the tariff as a weapon. He is weaponizing tariff rate. He threatened Canada and Mexico on raising the tariff rate, not because of trade, but because of other problems or issues like immigration and some other matters. Therefore, that is one aspect. The other is that he is genuinely arguing that the employment in US will increase if the US imports less and so on. But that, I think, is a very mistaken impression. He was, for example, arguing about levying a tax on steel. Now, the almost 25% tariff on steel. Now, if the import of steel, the cost of importing steel goes up now by 25% in the United States, because that is where the tariff is being imposed. Then the price of steel goes up, all right. Therefore, domestic producers may be able to supply steel. But those who use steel in order to produce other things will find their costs going up. And as a consequence of it, the products made by other companies using steel will go up as compared to other countries. And therefore, this is a self-defeating exercise. Trump is very, very much mistaken. In fact, this is the kind of policy that was pursued in the 1930s after the Depression. And this policy is called beggar my neighbor policy. And it essentially ended in the Depression deepening, because it is not, you cannot just expect the tariffs to go up and the prices to remain at the same level. And the prices of those goods on which the tariffs are imposed will go up, and it will have a series of other effects on the production. Therefore, yes, to come back to India, to answer your question, I think we'll need to watch what happens. For example, discriminating between countries on the import of the same commodity is a violation of WTO import. Then you will have to impose a rule saying import of steel from all countries, the tariff will increase. But increasing the tariff itself is a violation. But increasing the tariff of imports of some commodities only from some countries is a serious violation of the WTO regulations. Therefore, in a sense, what will happen or what can happen is more and more of trade agreements among groups of countries. So the world will be broken up into various groups, and the trade within the group will be at one level of tariff, and the trade with the other groups will be at another level of tariff. We need to watch, but I think the direction in which Trump wants to move is a wrong direction, and then we will, I think we really need to, India should organize itself along with other countries to fight that issue.
Coming to the fourth question, during your tenure as the RBI governor, the policy stance often shifted based on the prevailing economic conditions. What lessons can we draw from the past about the effectiveness of a neutral stance during periods of high uncertainty?
I do not know. The word neutral stance is used by the monetary authorities to say that the liquidity will be just accommodative and it will not be liberal or something. I don't agree with this description. To me, the decision on the policy rate itself gives what the stance is. Let us say the Reserve Bank of India has lowered the policy rate. As I have written somewhere, central banks cannot act like King Canute. You have to take action to enable the rate of interest to fall. And how do you do that? Only by increasing liquidity. When liquidity is tightened, the rate of interest goes up. When the liquidity is liberalized, then the rate of interest falls. Therefore, you really have to find out how much loosening has to be done in order to get the policy rate down to the policy rate they have announced, so that other rates in the market will fall. Therefore, that is the real approach. I mean, I think, as I said, it is. We are certainly living in a world of higher uncertainty. There are many things that could happen which will warrant a serious reaction. But the point is that we will have to act as and when things happen. But the point is, at the moment, given the situation relating to growth and price level, the decision to lower the rate of interest is appropriate. But if other things happen and if they take a very serious turn, we will have to at that time to take a fresh view on what the policy rate should be.
Now we'll go on to the student and professional life section. During the 1990s, India faced significant pressure on its foreign exchange reserves, particularly during the balance of payment crisis. As RBI governor, you were at the helm of managing the critical aspect of India's economy. Could you elaborate on the thinking behind RBI's approach to manage India's foreign exchange reserves during this period of time?
The crisis of 1991 was triggered by a serious balance of payments problem. Our deficit was already high. At the time came the Iraq-Kuwait war, and that worsened the balance of payment situation. First, because of the increase in the oil price, and the import bill almost doubled as a consequence of that. And also because of the fact that remittances from Middle East slowed down. And there is also a fact that people from there wanted to come back to India, and certain expenditures had to be incurred on that score also. Therefore, the already critical balance of payment situation got worsened to a large extent by the Iraq-Kuwait war. So the whole question is, what do we do in order to handle this situation? And there was also a lot of political uncertainty at that time. I think the VP Singh government fell, and then the Chandrasekhar government came, and that government also did not last. And therefore, in that situation, the various institutions had to really play a big role, and the Reserve Bank of India to really take the situation in hand and do what is best. Therefore, some major decisions were taken, like shipping gold and raising money from Bank of England and Bank of Japan. Because when I was visiting US at that time and trying to find out how to raise resources, it came out very clearly that many people thought that India has such a large quantum of gold in the reserves, but we are not using it to save the situation. So first of all, let me clarify one thing. It was never the idea of the Reserve Bank to sell gold. That is not possible. All that we wanted to raise was loan on the pledge of gold. And the Reserve Bank of India cannot borrow from any other authority other than a note issuing authority. That means only from other central banks. It cannot go into the market and that's not the thing. Therefore, we contacted the central banks and we found out that Bank of England and Bank of Japan were ready to give. But for that purpose, we had to export 44 tons of gold. Not 1 ounce or 2 ounces, 44 tons of gold. And that was sent by a chartered flight from India to England. It was kept in the vaults of Bank of England, and on that basis the loan was given. So that is, such decisions had to be taken. Actually, the Chandrasekhar government gave permission to it, because we could not have, Reserve Bank could not have done it without the permission of the government. The Chandrasekhar government gave the permission. But by the time that the Chandrasekhar government has fallen from power, but it was continuing as the caretaker government, as a caretaker government. So I would like to emphasize to people that who are young people, who have not lived through that period, I mean in the sense of understanding everything that was happening around, is not the devaluation that we did, not the shipping of the gold, but the fact that after doing those things, which were required for introducing a certain amount of stability in the economy, we introduced the structural reforms. Look at the foreign exchange. What we did, we devalued, right? Yes, but that we did not end there. But we entirely changed the foreign trade regime. We moved to a more liberal policy, reduced the tariffs, reduced the quantitative controls, and in the foreign exchange market, we moved away from what we call the exchange rate system, which was providing at that time to a dual market system, and then finally to a market determined exchange rate system. This is exactly the opposite of what we used to do earlier. Whenever there was a balance of payments problem, we used to go on tighten and tighten, and even more tighten. No, we did change the policy itself. That's the starting point of the liberalization program. So we will. So the most important thing is that the reforms that were introduced at the time are two components. One is stability, and the other is structural reforms, which will prevent such crises from happening. That is the idea. In fact, I must say that post 1991, that we have not had a severe balance of payments problem where we have to go to the IMF and stand in a queue and get money. I mean, I think this is not what is happening. But the point is that we took the appropriate actions, and some of these actions required to be made by the Reserve Bank, which we took, and that's how that was the starting point of the new liberalized regime.
Looking back, what do you think could have been done differently in terms of RBI's response to global economic trends during your time as a governor?
What is the alternative? The alternative could have been to say that we will go back to the old system and tighten the system and do it. Some people have said that. After all, this was only a balance of payments problem. You could have solved the balance of payments problem, but not changed the economic philosophy. You could have continued with the old system. So that was the alternative. But I don't think that is the right alternative, because as Manmohan Singh said in the first budget, it's an idea whose time has come, quoting Tehiku. So that is the situation warranted something, not business as usual, something else. And that's why we did. But I don't think any alternative system would have given the results.
Next question is regarding your student life. So many students today struggle with uncertainty in choosing their career path in economics. So when you were a student, did you face similar confusion? And how did you navigate your way from doing your thesis to becoming a professor at IIM Ahmedabad and eventually serving as the governor of RBI?
Well, the point is that all of us have to make decisions as you go along. That is why I call the book Forks in the Road. Not in single, not fork in the road, it's forks in the road. Because as you move along, that at every point you have to take a decision. So that way, as a student, the most important thing is to take a decision as to which subject you want to specialize in. So that happened, and therefore, in the 1950s, the Indian economy was such that the best career path was going to the civil service, and the best minds actually went into civil service. So that was the one decision that you had to take, whether you want to go and write the competitive examination or you want to go out and do your PhD. So I chose to go abroad and do my PhD. So that's a decision. But there are other factors also which made me decide to do that. So and so at every point you make a decision. But I must say that the decision to move from academia to the Reserve Bank was totally unplanned. It came as a surprise in the sense that when I was asked, I had not been thinking of it. And in some sense, it's unplanned. I won't say it is accidental, but it's unplanned. And so once I moved into the policy making, the rest followed. I think that's it. And therefore I wouldn't say becoming governor was accident. I think that's your progression from wherever one was. Therefore, I enjoyed academia. I taught in the US, I taught in India, and I think that the years that I spent both in abroad and in India were very good. And therefore, as I said, that I was not planning to be moved out of academia.
So now let's move on to some questions that our MSE students, club members have asked. So first one, Harshil of BA first year has asked, the labor capital dynamics is expected to change with the arrival of AI workers. especially true in the manufacturing industry. Will this change dynamic affect inflation? If yes, how and why?
Well, the point, the critical point is not inflation. The critical point is employment. The biggest thing that is bothering people now is that will the new technologies, machine learning, AI, genetic, and so on, what will happen to it as a consequence of that? Basically, what is happening now is, for producing 1 unit of output, the extent of labor required is becoming less. This is true even in the earlier period, whenever from the beginning of the industrial revolution. But then the increase in the output was such that it not only employed as many people as they were at the beginning, but also more. Therefore, so many people say, even today, saying technology has not reduced the number of people working, but it actually expanded. But the whole question really is the nature of the technology that we are now talking about. AI has a dimension which is very different from the earlier technologies. It is not muscle power that is being replaced. This is the power of the mind which is being replaced. Therefore, in that sense of the term, the extent of labor required per unit of output will come down. But the output may increase, but not necessarily absorb the labor to the same extent. Therefore, what we really need to look at the moment is that what are, in a country like India, what are the areas or the sectors of economy in which relatively there is a greater amount of labor used, like the hospitality industry. Even if AI comes, finally the coffee will have to be served by somebody, I think, and therefore it will absorb a labor. So I am also saying the word relatively more labor intensive, because yes, as compared to steel industry, the labor that will be used now will be higher in the hospitality industry. So what we need to do, as I said, is to identify sectors of economy or sectors of industry where there is a relatively greater labor use and use that. Therefore, we need to have a combination of sectors of economy where an intensive use of AI may be there. And there are sectors of the economy in which relatively more labor is available. I think we have to move in that direction. This is, as somebody said, that as the new technology comes in, the highly powerful minds will get absorbed anyway. I mean, I think they will be needed. But it is the middle level that we should be affected. Because what the middle level labor can do in a firm or in a company, that can be substitution of AI, and that can reduce the labor content. But we should really see whether critically examine sectors of economy in which, relatively speaking, there can be more greater use of labor.
So now I'll call upon our BA first year students, Om and Sudhir, to ask their questions. You come here. You come here.
Given that RBI, I have a question.
Huh?
I have a question for you.
I'm sorry.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, right.
Given that RBI is injecting 60,000 crores into the market within 1 month through open market operations, There are short-term risks facing fueling inflation, rupee depreciation, and asset bubbles in the economy. Instead of addressing the structural economic issues, are we just kicking down the can down the road by creating bigger problems?
No, I didn't get it. Because yeah, I see. The point really is the injecting of the liquidity is part of the decision to lower the rate of interest because the policy rate. Because the policy rate can be lowered only by injecting liquidity. Therefore, the critical question to ask is whether it is appropriate, given the situation, that the policy rate be lowered. As I told you earlier, the point to take into account is that not only the decision to lower the rate of interest, but also the extent to which this lowering should be done. I think they have managed to work out a compromise by sticking to lowering the rate, but not by a very large extent, but by 25 basis points. Therefore, that is the way in which they have tackled the problem.
Good afternoon, sir. My question to you is, recently the RBI reduced the share of the weightage of food and fuel as part of its consumer basket. So, was it because it was previously like overvalued, or is it done with a motive to reduce the inflation figure?
See, the weights in the price index are based upon the percentage of expenditure on that commodity to the total expenditure. Therefore, in the budget, how much food items constitute out of the total expenditure. What has happened now is that we do consumption expenditure survey from time to time. So it's more recently also that the consumption expenditure survey for 22-23 is released, and the consumption expenditure for 23-24 have also now been released. These expenditure surveys now show clearly that the food component is coming down. It is the other non-food component which is increasing. That is what you will find whenever the economy is moving from one level to the other. Previously, the consumption expenditure survey is available on 2011-12. So it is a long time since the last consumption expenditure survey was done. Actually, there was a survey done once, but then that survey was junked by the government. So we don't officially have the data on consumption expenditure survey. Therefore, I don't think that this was any attempt to really show the inflation down by reducing the food component. I think what is happening is, even in the rural areas, the food component is coming down.
Thank you for that. So now we move on to the rapid fire round. We'll ask you questions and then you should be answering them in like one-liners.
Yeah.
So, what's the most rewarding part of being involved in economic policy? The analysis, the implementation, or the impact you see years down the road?
I think what's critically important is the impact of the economy. Finally, analysis must lead to results.
Favorite economist of all time?
What?
Favorite economist of all time?
Favorite economist? No. What is that? What you said?
A favorite economist of all time?
Doctor. Keynes.
Keynes. If not an economist, what career would you have chosen?
Well, I could have chosen philosophy.
One myth about RBI governors that isn't true.
That is all powerful.
One economic term you wish people understood better.
marginal efficiency of capital.
Favorite breakfast meal, idli or dosa?
Neither.
One moment of your life you want to relive.
What?
One moment of your life you want to relive.
I think when we introduced the unified market exchange system, and when the market moved smoothly on the opening day, that was the date of market.
Favorite economic concept?
Growth dynamics.
One motto of your life.
One,
One motto of your life.
do your best.
If you have 30 seconds to inspire someone, what would you say?
Success often comes to those who dare and act. It seldom goes to the timid.
Thank you.
Alright, that's all. That's all.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Rangarajan, thank you so much for your time and valuable insights today. Your perspectives on the Union budget, as well as the monetary policy and other economic matters, have been enlightening us, and it has been an absolute honor for us to have this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you for giving this opportunity to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.